Speikin's neurodiversity, several papers here, I'm sure you've come across them, so many of them with other individuals as well, but not all with the same set, and starting originally with some of my papers. We've been working together as a team for a while. So what's this about? Well, my idea was that actually as soon as we start to get collaborative morality, now this is something that primatologists show isn't really there in other primates or apes. This is a sense in which one would understand what the entire group needs, understand the entire group and be judged on one's commitment, willingness and contribution to the group. So collaborative morality is seen as one big cognitive or social development in human evolution. I think that's very important because once hominin groups operate under a collaborative morality rather than just individual alliances, which is something we see in other primates. Chimpanzees have one ally, another ally. They may drop one ally, another, but they never have that set of collaborative relationships. Once hominins move to a point of having collaborative morality in which their reputation is based on their contribution to the group, I think that's very important. It buffers vulnerabilities, so it means that individuals with various vulnerabilities can be cared for by others whose reputation increases through that care and who then themselves might be helped in future. But it also provides opportunities for an appreciation of specialist skills. Not everybody has to contribute in the same way, and specialist and different skills can be appreciated and be part of a group through making a contribution, but without necessarily making a contribution in the same way. So we've done quite a lot of modern psychological studies looking at the different traits which we might see in terms of modern populations, in which obviously there's several elements of neurodiversity. Some of our research is focused particularly on the autism spectrum, but obviously there's other elements of diversity, extroversion, introversion, or dyslexia and other types of minds. And I think that when we look at cognitive evolution, we tend to over-focus on the single mind and forget the significance of how different minds might have interacted together. So my original paper was all about the origins of modern humans being not about the change in an original mind, not the working memory of Wynne and Coolidge, but instead about an interaction between minds, an ability to take the strengths of different minds and put them together. That these would allow these new technologies, new collaborations to be built. Now I won't go through all the details, it'd be far too long if I did. But I'll look at the how we built those modern analogies, a little bit about archaeological evidence, because we've also been working much more recently on the material record that correlates with different types of minds and how different individuals with different cognitive styles can actually use the material record around them differently. And some of the issues, I'm not suggesting it's perfect. So individuals with autism, and here we're going to look at that spectrum of neurodiversity by particularly focusing on autism, have a different perception and understanding, which brings certain talents. So what's interesting is that various research has shown that there's differences in subtle differences in perception with autism. For example, most commonly, many individuals with autism are highly focused on the fine details in their environment, whereas other individuals may just see the bigger picture but fail to see the detail. Those differences in perception tend to lead to differences in analytical reasoning, differences in interpretation of the environment around them, and may also lead to differences in interests. If you're particularly aware of the fine detail in things, you may then be particularly able to analyze how a tool might be working around its detail, how to make that detail better. And then you might be particularly focused on a special interest, for example, on making very fine scale, highly technological things. And so there are a whole range of perceptual, analytical and social skills which have been related to autism. For example, three-dimensional design and understanding of chemical reactions, calendrical systems. I won't go through all the details, but wasn't talents and certainly not ubiquitous in individuals with autism. There's nonetheless a widespread abilities and talents at remembering calendrical things, remembering events from the past, being able to move around mathematical things as well, often exceptional abilities to focus on a specific task, concerns for fairness, as well as different visual things such as being better at seeing fine movement and identifying certain figures. I won't go through all of this. We don't really have the time, but do ask me if you're interested. Identifying embedded figures, being able to see different things differently in patterns, picking up patterns, detecting pitch, detecting different smells. It's not difficult to imagine how these kind of abilities may be important in a context in which you're trying to find food in an environment. Being able to sense fine movement might help you hunt. Being able to identify optical illusions might help you see certain things that other people can't. But that's not to say that that makes you a better hunter. It makes you someone who can pick up different signals than someone else can and put the two together, and there you have a better way of hunting. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're better at producing tools, but it means that you might be better at producing certain type of tools. Put that with someone who's better at producing completely different types of tools, and there you have societies that are better able to cope with environmental changes, better able to find new solutions. So for me, that integration between different minds is perhaps what makes modern humans successful. Or at least it might be. I'm also pretty convinced by self-domestication, but don't worry about that now. So, we've also done some further evidence looking at how individuals with different levels of autism quotient will interact differently with material culture, and that I think is really interesting because we ask questions about what types of things you might take in a fire, what types of things you might take to a desert island in which you're going to be sort of abandoned. And we discovered that individuals on one end of the spectrum, moving towards autism, rather than individuals on the other extreme, will tend to take very practical elements away with them from a fire. So statistically much more likely to take something practical which might allow them to survive than they would be to take a teddy bear or a photograph of a loved one. I like this example because neither one nor the other of these different approaches to material things are right. In a crisis in the past, one might argue that if there was a population faced with disaster, really would like some people to take some of the memorabilia and other people to take the practical things that allowed you to survive, because we probably need both in order to survive today. And in fact, I think that may be why these differences create effective societies, and perhaps this is something we can even see in the Paleolithic and the archaeological evidence, where we might have elaborate art, but we also have maps and calendrical systems and highly analytical ways of looking at the world. They're not necessarily made by the same people. We can also see some of this cropping up when we look at art, and I'm not suggesting that Upper Paleolithic art was made predominantly or all by individuals with autism. However, we know that individuals with autism tend to have that fine detail focus, have much higher percentages of individuals with autism have a fine detail focus, and the fine detail focus tends to be associated with prodigious talent at realistic depiction. So this, for example, if we look at this example, Here we have on the left an image of a horse drawn by Nadia. Now, Nadia was roughly 6 years old when she drew this horse, and she was a little girl with autism. It's an incredible drawing, in fact, really realistic and quite remarkable, and yet Nadia was incapable of speech at the point at which she made that drawing. I asked Chloe, my niece, who was the same age, to draw a horse, and this is a very good horse for a neurotypical 6-year-old. So this is a very good drawing of a horse for a neurotypical girl. And you can see the difference here in the perception of the environment. Chloe hasn't perceived the detail in the horse. She knows it has 4 legs, and she knows it's got an eye, and she knows it's got a mane and a tail, and that's what she's remembered. Nadia, and she couldn't see the horse when she did this drawing, has remembered all of that detail because she has an extraordinary ability to remember and to see fine details. And in fact, this is another individual with autism, and they agreed to let me show them their image as well. And what's interesting about this is a 3-year-old with autism, and they've drawn a bike. But when they've drawn that bike, they've shown the cogs on the bike and how they work. So there's an extraordinary attention to how something's working. Whereas other individuals, when asked to draw a bike, will maybe just draw 2 wheels. This shows the thought and the observation of what's happening. Actually, we have some alternative examples as well. So there is a syndrome called Williams syndrome. It's too simplistic to say it's the opposite of autism. That would be a far too simplistic thing to say. But what it does do is it's associated with a lack of attention to fine detail. This is a drawing of an elephant by an 11-year-old with Williams syndrome. So people with Williams syndrome are highly social. They're very, very focused on social interactions and not very interested in kind of analytical reasoning or technological things or fine detail. And this is fascinating because by 11, a neurotypical child would have been able to draw a horse. But for this child with Williams syndrome, their perception of the horse has really not been any more complex than it's got something a bit head-like and a body. And yet what's interesting is if we look at what they say about it, it's really, really interesting. Here we go, elephant description. What an elephant is, it's one of those animals. What an elephant does, it lives in the jungle. So they can't draw the elephant, but this is what they describe. It can also live in the zoo, and what it has long grey ears, fan ears, ears that blow in the wind. It has a long trunk that can pick up grass or pick up hay. If they're in a bad mood, it can be terrible. If the elephant gets mad, it could stomp, it could charge. Sometimes elephants can charge. They have long tusks. You don't want an elephant as a pet. You want a cat or a dog or a bird. They're really social, really thinking about why are you asking them about elephants. I don't think you should have one. They're fine, but leave them in the zoo. And I love the way in which these contrasts provide us with an illustration of how differently people around us can see the world, that we assume that every human brain works in the same way, and yet it doesn't. And yet each of us makes a really important contribution in a different way. And these different contributions, for me, are reflected in art, where we see tremendous talent and fine detail, as well as this not particularly great image of an owl. We see a variety of different ways of seeing the world and not just representing it. So most people with autism are typically not diagnosed. That is to say, if people have autism without intellectual impairment, many feel that it doesn't actually have any particular significance. That is to say, there are certain strengths and weaknesses, and they like the strengths and they'll deal with the weaknesses, and they're not visible, therefore, part of society but not different, yet with a brain that works differently. So in a study of 454 students, Simon Baron-Cohen found that 4.6% scored in the range suggestive of ASD. And this is our study of York undergraduates, which showed exactly the same thing. And he commented that none of those meeting the criteria for autistic spectrum condition complained of any current unhappiness. Indeed, many reported that within a university setting, their desire not to be sociable, together with their desire to pursue their narrow, repetitive interests, was not considered odd and even was valued. So that, I think, casts into question the whole idea of a single type of evolutionary track towards a more socially astute person that is the model of the human mind. I think there's many different minds, and I think that the way in which they work together has been really quite important. And in fact, the genetics of autism demonstrates its existence in the past. I'll just go through these quickly. But also positive selection dating to at least the Upper Paleolithic and possibly before. So that demonstrates, therefore, that there were certain advantages to autism, with certain autism genes emerging around the origins of modern humans, despite some of the disadvantages. So, are there issues? Yes, I think there is. One of the issues, I think, is that I worry, we've looked at issues for everyone, I should look at issues for mine as well. I worry that what we're looking at in our studies is not necessarily autism, but detail focus. We've been looking at the material record, how people deal with material things, we're looking at particular strengths, and there's quite a balance there on the detail focus part of autism, but some people without autism also have high detail focus, and some people with autism don't, although there's a strong correlation. The message for me, though, about neurodiversity still stands. Perhaps we should replace our discussion of autism with a discussion of detail focus versus not detailed focus perception. But that would still be, for me, a discussion, surely, about how different minds work together, and there isn't really one single human mind. So there were several models and examples in cognitive archaeology where people have tried to use the principles of making a connection between how something works in the modern day, how that creates a behavior, and how we can identify that behavior in the past and therefore try and infer how capacities change. No model or interpretation is without its issues, but nonetheless, I think they all move forward our understanding of cognition, and there's many things I haven't really talked about here, but I hope it's given you some insights into the types of evidence we can use when we try to understand human cognition, the types of issues we face in the challenge of trying to understand how people thought in the past, and the types of processes and pressures that might have changed human cognition. Thank you.